My name is Jacob Padron. I have the honor of being the artistic director of Longworth Theater based here in New Haven, Connecticut. Welcome to our podcast, and I am so honored to be joined by our guest of honor today, Michael Rohd. Michael, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I'm honored to sit here and talk with you on the podcast.
This is excellent. So Michael is a theater maker. I feel like you're an activist. You're a teacher, and you're going to talk a little bit more about who you are and what you do. So share with us.
Okay. It is really nice to be here with you, and it's really nice to be hosted by Longworth Theater. I will start, before I introduce myself, by saying I am such a fan of the work you and your team are doing here in New Haven.
Oh, thank you.
The work of bringing productions out of just one anchor institution and being all around community in partnership, engaged, and making really exciting theater adventures for folks in different spaces. Like, you know that's a love of mine. My whole sort of creative life has been interested in figuring out how theater happens in non-traditional spaces, not just because it's cool and dynamic, although it is, but because it puts one in different relation to one's place and the people in that place. So super excited to be a part of that journey that you're on with this company.
Thank you so much. So for our viewers and listeners, tell us more about your genesis.
Yes. So I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm the grandchild of Russian Jewish immigrants. I went to school in Chicago, and very early in my journey as a theater maker, I got a little disenchanted with what I was observing at the time, which would be the late 80s, early 90s, of a lot of theater institutions having a relationship with a particular audience that often didn't live anywhere near the building where the work occurred, and not having much of a relationship with the place and the community or the neighborhood where they were actually based. And I'd had the good fortune in college to have some great mentors, and then after school, who were always asking questions about what's the purpose of theater and what's the relationship between the art we make, the people we make it with, the people we make it for, the place where this building or this project resides. And so I think my genesis has just been an ongoing conversation with collaborators and colleagues and people who live in the places where I've had the opportunity to make work about what can theater do? Like what's it about and what's the context? Maybe that meant working with health departments or local arts councils. It meant a lot of different things. And eventually when I started a theater company in my early 30s called Sojourn Theatre, first in Virginia and then in Portland, Oregon, I was really interested in figuring out how can a theater company itself, which didn't have a building, but had an ensemble and a sort of mission, how can we find ways to work in relation to and in partnership with community and community nonprofits and residents and local municipal government in ways where the projects that we make somehow are in relation not just to our own artistic ambitions and aspirations, which are important and real, but also how can we make projects that are engaged in the conversations and challenges of this place where we are? What is the way we develop something? I think we have a mutual colleague, Luis Alfaro, who I think is a genius of our field, a leader, personally, someone I have deeply admired for many, many years. And although our work doesn't necessarily look similar, I have always taken great nourishment from the fact that he is always asking questions about what the theater form can do, not just for the audiences who traditionally go to the theater, but for the communities that he is a part of and the communities that he cares about and the values that are central to him and those he works and lives with. And I always found that really inspiring, not just in terms of quote unquote engagement, but sort of the dramaturgical development of any project.
And I feel like in many ways he's connected to our evolution as a theater company, because we, when we did our first artistic congress, which is we're doing with you, he did the keynote address with Dominique Morisseau, and they shared love letters.
I think I watched that online.
Yeah, and I think you also shared some reflections yourself. So he wrote a love letter. This is sort of my hope, my dreams, my commitments to the future of the American theater. And he reflected on the moment that we were in. It was 2020, October, in the middle of the pandemic, and he said the great pause has become the great possibility. And this idea of us taking the pause to really think about what is the future? How can we activate our imaginations in this moment so that we don't go back to business as usual? Yeah. And that's one of the things I think I talk about a lot, that I'm really proud of Longworth Theater for. When things started to open back up, I think a lot of theaters went back to the thing that they knew, and we said, no, we're not gonna do that. We're actually going to refashion and really change our relationship to our community. And maybe you can share this story, how we met. We met through our mutual friend, colleague, inspiration, Bill Rausch. But I'm curious if you can share more about how Willful, which was the project that you did at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, how that came about. I was your line producer, but I'm curious if you'll share more about that.
Yes.
That connection.
I mean, I'll say that we met when I was working on a large, ambitious, and difficult project at OSF, and you were a bit of a savior in that you're a very good line producer and were very helpful to me, both in terms of keeping my sanity amidst that complexity, but also just at helping the work take the shape that it wanted to take by managing many complex relationships and needs in a large institution. I first worked with Bill in 1989, 1990, when I assisted him on an early Cornerstone show, one of their first ensemble shows, which was an adaptation of the Lorca play, The Shoemaker's Prodigious Wife, and it was produced in Washington, D.C. under the title The Video Store Owner's Significant Other. And it was the original ensemble, and I assisted Bill through that process, which was I was like right out of undergrad.
Amazing.
And that was a great experience. Then he and I stayed friends and colleagues. I worked with him a few other times over the years, including here at Longworth when I assisted him on The Good Person of New Haven.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I was here on that, and that was another time I was here. And when he took over at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, he had been staying in touch with me about work Sojourn Theatre was doing in Portland, Oregon, a few hours north, up the I-5 corridor.
Yes.
And he came in 2007 and saw an adaptation of Good Person of Szechuan that my company had done called Good, which was staged in a Subaru dealership, where audiences of 60 moved through for a couple hours this giant facility. And it was a cool production. It was really fun, and we worked really hard on it. Bill came up and saw it, Chris Acebo came up and saw it, and they were excited about the possibility of OSF having its first site-specific and devised work. So that was 2007. It was 4 years between them and Willful, which was a period of, I think, Bill attempting to socialize that idea at the company, inviting me down to do workshops, to work with company artists.
Yes.
And then ultimately that show opened in the summer of 2011.
Yes.
In August, after a lot of work. And you and I first connected because you were there, of course, working with Bill on the leadership team.
Yes.
And became a line producer on the project. And we had some very intense experiences together in the summer of 2011.
We sure did. We sure did, because it was such an ambitious project and so different than what that company was used to producing. You know, I think the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, is a very complicated repertory, has really complicated systems. And I think part of your offering was, can we work outside those systems in a way that's gonna make really, I think, a really great artistic product and really engage audiences in new and dynamic ways. And I'm gonna ask kind of a big question, which is, so Longworth Theater, as you know, we were in our building for 57 years. We were in a rented space in the food terminal. We decided to not renew our lease and to adopt a new producing model to bring theater to the people. So rather than people being anchored to one space, it's about telling stories and having experiences in different parts of the city, all across New Haven and the region. You will not be surprised, Michael Rohd, when I tell you it has been a journey. It has been lots of roses and thorns, right? There were some that celebrated the innovation and like, yes, bring theater to the people. And then there were those who I think really struggled with the idea that, can Longworth Theater still be Longworth Theater without that space, right?
What do you think when they had that struggle? Can it still be Longworth Theater? What do you think that meant to them? What is the Longworth Theater? Can it still be? What is that?
I mean, I think it was the maybe the identity of the company and the experience of the company was about that space.
The space.
And not for nothing, that space was off the highway.
Yeah.
And so in terms of who was coming, it was a lot of folks who were coming off the shoreline, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And how can we make space and build bridges to the city?
Yep.
Because it was a very homogenous audience.
Yeah.
So lots of roses and thorns.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has happened for us, which I actually spoke to Rachel about in our first episode, is when you don't have a building, there's something about not being, you can't hide behind your desk anymore. There's something about that you have to be out in the community. And I actually feel like in the last 2 years, something has actually shifted as Longworth Theater sort of thinks about its relationship to our city, to our region, to our partners, and to our audience. And because you are so connected to kind of the larger purposes of what theater can do, that theater can be a catalyst for helping us understand the world, helping us understand our relationships, being a catalyst for social justice. Can you just reflect a little bit more on sort of the possibilities for Longworth Theater as we think about really centering the community in a new way because of our model?
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I think it's so beautiful and inspiring what you're working to do with that model. And no doubt, roses and thorns, right? I mean, no doubt in terms of the reception to that. I think when one starts to move out of a singular space or building, one starts to have a greater opportunity to engage the notion of a civic. I think when you're in one place only, particularly when it's not even central to a lot of the people in the place perhaps, it's really hard to claim, to construct, to sort of work a civic presence.
Yes.
And I guess when I say the word civic, I'm thinking about the fabric of a community that includes its residents, its leaders, both elected and unofficial.
Yes.
Like sort of where are the central pockets of cultural activity, of community vibrancy, of community voice.
Yes.
And if one is in one building and all those voices and beings need to come to you, inevitably you're not gonna be building threads to all of them because they're elsewhere.
Yes.
And you're only gonna be building connections with those who want to make the trip.
Yes.
And a lot of folks can't make the trip or don't have the time or capacity to make the trip. So when you sort of place yourself as you are in the civic with lots of threads possible because you're going to different places, I feel like then you have the opportunity to sort of build a collective imagination or a civic imagination together.
Yes.
Because suddenly you're able to take stories to different places. You're able to build stories with different people. You're able to sort of land and operate in lots of different contexts. And without that, you're going to be at a remove. You're going to be marginalized. You're going to be marginalizing others.
Yes.
And right now it feels like you're saying maybe this is a place where there don't have to be margins, at least in respect to how we think about storytelling and connection.
Yes.
We will go to lots of different places and we will, as the saying goes, we will center the margins because that's often where the most important kind of ideas and opportunities and sort of radical new ways of thinking are anyway.
Yes. So talk more about this idea of the civic imagination, because this is what you are doing at the University of Montana, right?
Yeah.
Share more about it's a lab that you've created, the Lab for Civic Imagination.
Yeah, it's called the Co-Lab for Civic Imagination, just to keep that idea of collaboration kind of in there rather than a singular person's lab or something.
Yes.
For me, the past batch of years, and I talked for a while about civic practice.
Yes.
And I still kind of talk about that some, but it's sort of moved for me into this notion of civic imagination because it's not just about like, what is the thing that someone does? It's what's a community's capacity to imagine together. So I think that artists have a role. I don't think artists have what's the word? I don't think artists own imagination.
Okay.
Right? I don't think artists are the only experts in imagination. I do think artists across disciplines do spend a good portion of their life thinking about sort of refining and deploying their imagination in a variety of expressive and connective ways. So, there are medical personnel in a community whose work is healing. We now know that actually the members of our community who heal are not just those who are credentialed doctors and nurses and specialists. Many people have healing practices with or without those degrees. But we do know there are people who really have spent a lot of time working on healing and health. We should allow those folks, whatever their background and lived experience and knowledges are, to take the lead on healing. Whether that's sort of somebody at a cultural center who has a healing practice and works with neighbors, or it's somebody at the hospital who sees patients. Like, a lot of folks do work in healing. So again, everyone has imagination. Everyone imagines every day. You have to imagine what you're going to wear when you sort of leave the house. But there are folks, culture workers, culture makers, heritage holders, artists, creative practitioners, all these different terms, folks who sort of say, I'm going to spend time on my expressive practice. I have trained in my sort of creative assets. I don't think we tap those individuals to be leaders in the imaginative needs we have in our communities. We don't have good policy without imagination, right? We don't have reconciliation and repair without imagination. We certainly don't have vision without imagination. So why aren't the artists in our communities being looked at as natural resources for the work we need to do to build the communities we want to and to heal in the ways we need to? So I think civic imagination is sort of looking at the collaborations between artists, culture makers, creatives in our communities, and everyone else, so that we are building a community capacity to envision what's next.
So that sounds like everything that you just expressed is so powerful and so inspiring. And as someone who's been able to bear witness to this work and its power and its influence, I'm curious if we can look at the other side of it, which is, what are the challenges of this work, right? What is when we talk about engaging communities in this way and to have civic imagination, I feel like, who's going to say no to that? But I imagine, like, when we make art, making art can sometimes be difficult. So I'm curious if you can share, like, what are the challenges of this work?
Yeah, a couple of things that come to me when I think about challenges are, one, lots of folks don't necessarily see artists as being needed in those conversations, or being useful, or having tools to contribute. So there's a lot of advocacy work to do. I know you do this as an artistic director all the time when you're in conversation with municipal leaders or funders, or folks at nonprofits that are not arts nonprofits, where they're like, great, we like what you do, but like, why does it concern us? I mean, artists are constantly having to make the case for their value. For a long time in this country, a lot of the case we've been making is about the economic development, the economic impact. That's not negligible, that's significant. I do think it's the wrong thing to put all our eggs in that basket. I think really diminishes what artists do, can do, have done, will continue to do. I think it operates firmly only in a sort of capitalist framework, and doesn't acknowledge all the other aspects that make a community holistically whole and healthy, and that artists contribute to. So the challenges are capitalism.
Okay.
The challenges are people not really being taught, raised, socialized to think about the arts as meaningful outside decoration or entertainment. And I think another challenge is within the arts world itself. I think you'll find lots of artists who say, I don't really want to do that. Totally cool. Artists shouldn't have to do that and are valuable regardless. But I think there are many artists who go through training programs or kind of find their own practice or livelihood and have never considered it. So I actually think a challenge that I know I'm sort of engaging in my educator self is always trying to make sure that younger artists, but also artists wherever they are in their journey, recognize that they have the assets and skills if they want. If they open up the orientation to sort of how they see their potential in community a little bit, there's even more they could be doing. They could be deploying their tools in ways that contribute, not just in the products that they make, but in the process tools that they bring to community process.
That's really, Thank you for
Way off
sharing that
topic.
story.
Sorry.
No, thank you for sharing that story. So, okay, so
We're gonna cut. Let's
so
cut all
Michael,
that.
so Michael, you were here for your site visit because you are going to be a part of our second Artistic Congress. So this artistic kind of convening where we're pulling together artists, activists, students, journalists to talk about the kind of larger purposes of what theater can do. We did our first one in 2020. It was supposed to be in person, but because of the pandemic, it was online. Now, 4 years later, we're doing it again. And the theme is that theater is essential to a thriving democracy. And so you've proposed that we are going to do some what we call civic scores. Can you share for our listeners and viewers what that is? Because I know that it's connected to this idea of civic imagination, but can you talk a little bit more about these civic scores in conjunction with the Artistic Congress?
Yeah. Usually when we think about theater, we think about plays and productions.
Yes.
Which is a beautiful part of theater and our main experience with it. I really believe that theater artists, in addition to being able to make productions, are capable of making spaces where people can come together and collaborate creatively and dive into some of the harder conversations that we face in our communities or sometimes don't face. So a civic score is when an artist develops not a written play, but a set of instructions or a set of opportunities or invitations for an audience, who in this case become participants, not spectators, to go through an experience together. So we have 3 artists who are basically designing and then will facilitate or lead an experience. And each one, there's 3, there's one Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Each one has a sort of different topic or entry point. Each one will use that artist's particular creative practice as the sort of form in which they'll design. And the goal for those civic scores is to invite Congress attendees and community members to practice being in dialogue. I would suggest, and we've had enough conversations over the years that I know you, I believe you share this opinion, which is that one challenge we face in the United States of America today and in our communities is we struggle to talk to people who think and believe differently than us. Sometimes that's because the differences are so oppositional and in a way life negating or life affirming that we can't occupy the same space because it doesn't even feel safe. More often, I believe, it is because we are faced with people who believe differently than us and we don't know how to listen and we don't know how to express ourselves because we are afraid that we will be judged. We are afraid that we will hear something we don't want to hear. We are afraid it's a waste of our time. And sometimes all these things can be true. But the problem is if we can't talk to each other across difference, we can't actually make policy that works for everyone. If we can't talk to each other across difference, we actually can't envision a future that all of us might be able to share. And if we can't talk to each other across difference, we certainly can't do the work of repair. So I feel like artists have a really important role to play in that practicing of pluralism or practicing of democratic activity, which is, hey, give us an opportunity to be playful together. Playful doesn't have to mean silly. It just means in the true notion of play, let's be present, let's be imaginative and collaborative and creative, and let's have an experience where we are attempting to discuss, explore, investigate, work through something that we might not do with these people unless given the opportunity. So for me, I've worked for a while, and what I now have started in retrospect to think of as civic scores, sometimes they look like workshops, sometimes they look like a show that has participation in it, sometimes it just looks like a facilitated public meeting. But ideally, as a theater practitioner, I want to bring my assets as a writer, as a director, as a designer, as a dramaturg, as a maker, into the design of some period of time that strangers spend together working through something or discussing something. So these civic scores are 3 New Haven artists, Luciana McClure,
Yes.
Sun Queen,
Yes.
and Rob Esposito and 3 of his students. And each of them will design and lead one of these 90-minute sessions. And I'm working with them to support them. It's their work, but I'm sort of collaborating with them and continuing to invite them to think kind of boldly and expansively
Yes.
as they imagine what they will invite people through.
That's amazing and very inspiring. And that's going to really anchor us for the weekend, which I'm really excited and honored about.
I'm very honored to sort of be able to explore this idea as part of this Congress.
Yes. Oh my gosh, absolutely. I was struck by the when you said, a civic score can show up as a facilitated conversation. It can show up in what we're doing for our Congress. It can show up as a show.
Yeah.
Can you share more about the show that you just opened in Montana?
Sure. Yeah, I've been working for the last couple years on a project called State of Mind. And that project is looking at the behavioral crisis facing a lot of the United States, but in particular, I'm looking at the Western U.S., the state of Montana in particular, where it's got some of the highest suicide rates in the nation. Anxiety and depression for adults and youth are really high. There's a service provider shortage. There's a variety of reasons that there's a crisis out west.
Yes.
So we've built a sort of 4-part experience that we're now touring around Montana, particularly to rural and tribal communities. Mm-hmm. And the center of it is this show called State of Mind. It's an 80-minute piece, and it had its first tour stop a week ago in Conrad, Montana, a town of 2,300.
Wow.
We opened it in Missoula, Montana the week before that with multiple performances for stakeholders and partners.
Okay.
But now we have been on the road in our first truly rural setting, and next week we'll be in Great Falls, Montana. 2 weeks later, Glasgow, Montana, which is a very small community on the eastern side of the state. And the show we describe to the audience when they show up, we say, it's not quite a play, because a play usually tells one story. This has a lot of things going on in it, and as a matter of fact, some of it we're going to do for you, and some of it we're going to need to do together with you. We tell the audience that the show is actually more like an album. And I should tell you and our listeners and viewers that when an audience comes into this show, the set is a table with a record player and a bunch of vinyl albums. And the actors, the pre-show is the actors are bringing audience members up and inviting them to choose the next song on the pre-show list. Plus, they choose the score for the show itself. We have multiple moments in the show where we give them 2 or 3 albums and we say, which one do you want to hear for this part of the show? So the soundtrack's different every performance, pre-show and within the piece itself. And then the actors show the audience the track list. There's 14 tracks. And one of the performers says, we're going to do a side A and a side B. And the great thing about an album is that you can, once you get to know it, you can play it out of order. You can start anywhere and go to any track based on what you feel like. You haven't heard our album, but we're still going to let you choose the order. And they show them side A, 1 through 6, and they say, which track do you want to hear first? So every performance is different. So the actors don't know what's coming, which is super fun. Everybody's involved in a collective effort of choosing and then watching as we figure out how to navigate that. So the audience, at least so far, seems to really lean into that in a way that then makes the participatory sections feel a little more alive, I think, because they've already gotten involved in the dramaturgy.
Yes.
It's not an improvised show. It's a super crafted and structured show, but the order of it makes the feel of it really different from performance to performance.
Yes.
And so I think about that as a show, but it's kind of a civic score too, because of the level of participation, and also because the next morning we have what we call coffee and conversation, where the audience plus stakeholders in the community, the mayor, public health department officials, school folks, we have a place and we co-host a coffee. And it's really a coalition building effort. The whole project is sort of an excuse, in a way, to build coalition around the behavioral health needs of a community. And we had our first one of these last week, and it was so beautiful and so intense. And the show had opened up areas for conversation that people were like, we probably wouldn't have talked about this if not for last night. Or we had done a workshop with high school students the day before with teachers. All that was flowing into the coalition experience. So it felt like our work as artists was helping move forward into some beautiful and also really tricky spaces, like some conversations.
And when you have those, it's the next day. You facilitate those.
Me and the performers and the host. In this case, it was a counselor who runs the Ponderay County Mental Health Advisory Council. We co-facilitated that.
Wow. So just as a way to wrap us up, Michael, every time I get to be in space with you and hear your stories and hear about your work, I'm always deeply, deeply inspired. And I think about something that we say at Long Wharf Theater, which is that we want to be a theater of possibility. So to close us out, when you think about that idea of theater of possibility, when you think about the future of our art form, when you think about 7 generations ahead, which is something that Tai Defoe talks to me about, are we thinking 7 generations ahead? If you're not thinking 7 generations ahead, you're not thinking far enough out. What do you want to leave our listeners with and our viewers with? What's your hope? What possibilities do you see on the horizon as we think about the future of the American theater?
If I look 7 generations ahead, I see a time when we look back at the institutions of today as having been thoughtful and at times perplexed stewards of an unruly art form that actually doesn't belong to buildings or boards, but belongs to communities and practitioners. And 7 generations ahead, we look at a moment when it was a bit nurtured, but also kept precious and insulated, and that it, because of the work of you and others, it continued to find ways to live and grow in community, not just with experts and in buildings, but in the social and civic fabric of place. And 7 generations ahead, we don't have an association of theaters. We don't have national convening bodies to keep an industry alive. We have practices everywhere, and we have people coming together to share what they're doing and learning because it makes their work better and stronger, not because they need to keep a field thriving. The work is simply thriving because it's everywhere.
I love that. Michael Rohd, thank you so much for being in conversation with me. It is always such an honor and an inspiration. Thank you for those who were listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.